Hey everybody, I'm Pastor A.J. Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 17. I am really excited to welcome back Pastor Colby Martin, who, as you guys know, we did our live recording last year in Westminster, Maryland with. And I'm so excited that Colby is down in Charleston, South Carolina, because we're continuing to, use Colby and his work to help us with the church. So thank you, Colby, for being here.
My pleasure.
And for those that missed it, so Colby is the author of Unclobber and The Shift. And so last year we mostly focused on Unclobber. So folks that want to go back and listen to that's what we talked about. It's in Season 3, episode something towards the end. So go and find that. But today I want to do at least a brief introduction of The Shift. So your second book. Can you tell us a little bit about The Shift?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the invite. To get invited back to something means that the first time must have gone decent enough. So
it didn't suck.
Yeah, no, it didn't suck. Okay. I heard people complained about the volume of how loud you were, but we can't really.
Not with that one. But we had a sound tech for that one. So.
Oh, that's true. We did have a sound tech, and also if you edit out the opening first take, people are gonna have no idea what I'm referencing. So now I've sort of forced you to keep it in just for context. How great is that? You're loving me already. Okay. The Shift. Yes. So The Shift. Subtitle: Surviving and Thriving After Moving from Conservative to Progressive Christianity.
Yeah.
Originally, I wanted it to be a survival guide for becoming a progressive Christian, but I got overruled by the publisher, which happens. But that's really the heart of the book. I've been a pastor for 22 years. The first 10 years were in conservative evangelical spaces. And then I had my shift, if you will, that catapulted me out of the evangelical world and into, you could call it post-evangelical. I ended up latching onto the phrase progressive Christianity, and we can definitely unpack that more in a minute. But so the last 12 years I've been pastoring in churches and online and around the country in this progressive Christian post-evangelical space. And what I noticed is, as I've pastored, shepherded, I don't know how to do that word, walked alongside people who have made a similar move away from conservative Christianity towards something more progressive, open, liberal. While everybody's story is unique and different, there are surprising similarities, points of overlap where people experience the same kinds of obstacles on that journey. So I wanted to write something that would name for people what they're going through, and naming it is super powerful because that normalizes it. It's not hard because I'm doing it wrong. It's just hard because it's hard.
And I'm not doing it in a bubble, right? This isn't just me.
Yeah, you're not alone. It's hard because it's hard. And here are some things that if you haven't yet experienced, you very well may experience on your journey. And so, to the extent that it would be helpful to have someone who's traversed that territory before and walked alongside others, here are some helpful things on that journey.
And you say in this book, one of the things that was hard for you is because this is a vulnerable space for you, right? As you were still trying to work out some of that for yourself.
For sure. Yeah, this book was super vulnerable. Unclobber was vulnerable insofar as it was half of the book was it was memoir, right? It was telling the journey of my growing up conservative Baptist evangelical, then changing my mind on the topic of homosexuality in the Bible, getting fired from that church and starting a progressive church in San Diego. So it told that journey. That was vulnerable insofar as having to relive some of those stories. Yeah. That's a certain kind of vulnerability. The Shift was vulnerable in a whole different way because it was much more, all right, I'm showing all my cards here. You know what I mean? There's a sense in which some people could read some of the ideas in this book and immediately close it and be like, well, this guy's office rocker. This guy's not worth reading anymore. And so there's just, once you write a book, it gets locked in time. Unless you get to do a second edition where you can do updates, that freezes an author in any point in time. Yeah. And one of the whole points of the shift is to normalize growth in our faith and expansion in our beliefs, which means I'm not the same Colby that I was when I wrote it in 2019. That's 6 years ago. So I'm already different in many ways. And so knowing that was going to be an encapsulation of 2019 Colby was like, whew, okay, we'll see. Hopefully this will still be helpful for folks.
Well, and since 2019, right, like you've spent a lot more time in like mainline Protestant circles, and you're like, whoa, these people are living in a totally different like Christian world than you were used to.
Yeah.
Even from like a progressive theology perspective of still a sort of, I don't know if you'd call it like evangelical or just non-denominational kind of Christian space, right?
Yeah, so that was my whole world growing up, and then most of my pastoral world as well. But yeah, you're right. In the last 6 years or so, having much more exposure to the mainline world, to you Lutherans and Presbyterians and Methodists and Episcopalians, and things that denominations and traditions that I would learn about in college, at my Baptist college. And I don't think you as in Lutherans, fit into the right-hand column of my world religions and cults class.
Oh, tell me about these columns.
But Catholics did. Catholics were certainly in there. You're like, oh, sure. Yeah. Agree. Cosign. But like, from a conservative Baptist perspective, the main lines are a bit sketchy for sure.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? As a person who has never spent time in those circles, I don't know what they think about us.
Yeah. So I would say it's a lot of straw men, right? So your typical evangelical Christian is going to have an idea of what a Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopal is, and it's a straw man. It's not real. Right? They don't really know, but they think they know. And so the straw man usually consists of things such as, in evangelical Christianity, it's all about the relationship with Jesus, right? So Jesus didn't come to start a new religion, but to invite us into a relationship. And so it was all about the personal one-on-one relationship that you have with Jesus. This is why Catholics are a cult, because they require a mediator that you have to go through the priest. Right? And so when it comes to mainline, there's a bit of fuzziness there of like, they will see from afar sort of the trappings. This is sort of, again, their straw man, the trappings of the liturgy as distractions or tools of control or a barrier that actually prevents people from just about a relationship, right? It's not about a religion. And so y'all are seen as super religious, and high church is viewed as this negative thing. So low church is, it's not uncommon to be like, well, you just got to go back to Acts chapter 2 and what the early church was like. And that's the purest form of the church, where there was no institution and hierarchy, which again, it's a really bad straw man, because you read Acts and very quickly you realize they start to organize. They start to assign duties. They start to create hierarchies, because otherwise the thing won't last. Like movements, and that's what it was. Movements go in one of two directions. Either they do get structure and institutionalized to preserve the gains that the movement was trying to initiate, right? Or movements don't do that, and they fissure out. Like Occupy Wall Street's a good example of a movement that didn't have any larger structure of institution. And so it was a movement pushing back against things, but it just fizzled out. It had nothing. So anyway, I don't know how I got to Occupy Wall Street.
That's fine. I mean, I think I can go like both ways, right? Like I think that it is helpful to have like a larger church, right? And where we have these certain set of like, we talked about doctrine, right? And sort of a way that helps us to root our theology and stuff, and have, a larger church that like we can depend on and things like that. And also, institutions run by humans are not perfect. And I don't think there's anyone in any institutional church that would say, oh yeah, we've perfected this.
Totally.
That there's always room for error and growth and all of the above.
Yeah, it just was, it's probably ill-advised, but occasionally I will go on my YouTube channel where I do a lot of my work right now, and I'll engage in the comment section. Yeah. Some of them are just whatever, I enjoy it because I do it from a place of total centeredness and groundedness. Like nothing people say actually has any effect on me, right? It doesn't really, because it took me a while to get there, but I know they're not talking about me. So this one guy this morning said, you're just wrong because all religions are just evil and wicked. And I'm like, I hear you, but what I might rephrase that to say religion is just a benign tool that historically has many examples where humans have used that tool for bad, evil, wicked things, as well as use that tool for good healing and wholeness. So religion is just a tool. It can be used in all sorts of ways like any tool can.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. All right.
I was just curious, and I know I was told once, a certain church across the street was warning people against St. Matthew's and being like,
fun.
Don't go there. They have, be careful because they have like, they don't believe in like the Trinity. And I was like, what?
Straw man, told you.
It's
out there.
Where did that come from?
Yeah.
If anything, I would say that's maybe something that we would say about you, but
yeah. And they get
very strong focus on Jesus, right? But not so much the actual Trinity.
And they get squirrely about what they would call communion. So many terms like Mass or Eucharist would be a bit of analogy to that. They get squirrely about that. They really, really, really want distance between anything that looks, sounds, or smells like transubstantiation, where like the Roman Catholic, it actually becomes like that. They're so adverse to that idea that even anything close to it, becomes like, nope, that's too much like that. It's got to be just a cracker and just grape juice and that just pure symbol. That's it.
Where are you at now with sort of your sacramental theology around the table?
So I in 2014 we started a church in San Diego, which was post evangelical, open and affirming, fully inclusive. But it kind of still looked and sounded and felt like an evangelical church because that was my background. But we started to integrate more and more liturgical aspects to it because I just felt there's something important to be rooted into something larger than us. So from the get-go, we started serving communion every week, and that was a new thing in my pastoral vocational experience at that point. And the other day, I was visiting a church and went up to receive communion and got super emotional because I realized, that's the thing I missed the most. Because we closed our church about 2.5 years ago, and that's what I missed the most is looking people in the eyes, putting a piece of bread in their hand, usually saying their name. I'm really good with names, and so we have new people that would come and I'd meet them before the service. I would remember their name, and so saying their names if I could. And telling them body of Christ broken for you, and then they would dip it in the cup. And so just super meaningful part of the service. Theologically, what does that mean for me? I'm not sure. And insofar as I can take it in all sorts of different directions and say, yeah, all of that feels like it can have meaning and value. Like this is the crashing. For many ways, for me, it's the crashing of the divine into the earthiness of what it means to be human. It's the veil between heaven and earth being as thin as possible, sometimes even dissipating entirely. It is the reminder that there's a suffering aspect to what it means to be human, and that we are not alone in that suffering, but that we are comforted by a God who suffers with us. So it has all sorts of meaning. In terms of where I land on transubstantiation, consubstantiation, total metaphor, I'm not really settled on it.
Well, what you described is actually pretty decent Lutheran theology there too.
You've been recruiting me all day.
So we say, that like the idea of why we have just baptism and the Lord's Supper as the sacraments is, one, those are the only two things that Jesus says do this. And two, they have an earthly element attached to them, that it is a part of that, of connecting us with creation, where Jesus takes the most ordinary, everyday objects and makes them holy, and provides this gift through them, right? Yeah. And so a Lutheran perspective would say, we believe in the real presence of Christ.
Totally.
That Jesus is present, Martin Luther says, in, with, and under the elements.
I like that.
But they are still bread and wine. That they're both.
Sure.
and that we experience this gift because God gives it to us through that. Because God is always coming to us, right? That we're not earning our way to heaven, that God is continuing to come to us. And this is one of the visible signs that God gives us a reminder that God is continually coming to us and washing the slate clean over and over and over again.
And we need reminders of it constantly, every 7 days. I would argue we need reminders that you are beloved by God. Your sins are forgiven. You're like, you're good. You are connected with God. Here's a reminder.
It's also why, so we do typically do a corporate confession, so not like an individual confession thing. Yes. So this idea that we collectively as a community, and I think that maybe that's the difference in at least the Lutheran perspective and what you're describing as an evangelical perspective in our relationship with Jesus, is that like, yes, we have a personal relationship, but we also believe in our collective humanity together. And insofar that, Jesus came to save the world, not you specifically. That we're all in this together, and sort of like, and that's what it means. And so like, Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor. It's because like we're in this together, right? If one person is stumbling, falling short, we all are.
And that perspective is largely missing in most evangelical churches. It's hyper individualistic. Like you've nailed it. It's high, and you see, we see the natural outcome of that kind of thinking. We see it in America right now as we witness what is branded as evangelical Christianity. We've seen it is incredibly focused on you and your needs and your wealth and your well-being and your health. And
clearly if those are good, God likes you.
Yes. Oh yeah. That's God's preferred way of blessing. God's like, what's the best way to bless humans? I know. Stocks. Increased portfolio returns. That is God, you're so creative. What a creative God. It just boosts up the Dow Jones by 2.4%. Wow. Hyper individualistic, very little concern. In fact, I think it was,
how does that, I just like, to me, how does that jive with
it doesn't. Go on
with the understanding of the words and teachings of Jesus, right? Where Jesus is like, being wealthy is not the way. When your God is your belly, that is not the way. That, like, it's this preferential treatment of the poor, the marginalized, the whoever, right? That is not being invited to the table. That's continually who Jesus reaches out to, and pays attention to and invites in. That, like, I guess I have never understood how the prosperity gospel kind of mindset sort of makes sense.
Same. Even when I was deep in the evangelical world, that was several clicks too far from my understanding or appreciation. But you're trying to circle a square with that. I mean, the efforts that, and I'm painting with a broad brush when I say evangelical Christians, in part because it's not super wrong. Like, yes, not all. Yes, I hear you, and those are my people. So I feel like I have a bit of like, I can say this about them. You're not wrong to say they have really, they go out of their way to ignore some of the plain sayings of Jesus about you cannot serve two masters, right? Or wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Wherever your heart, that one. It is really hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Like Jesus's continued insistence that he who wants to find his life first must lose it. When people tried to crown him to give him authority, he rejected it. And so the constant striving within evangelical Christianity for wealth and power and protection, personal protection, is like, how are you? It really is. It is mind blowing the depths they go to get around what clearly Jesus was about. It's super frustrating. And that's why, real quick, I'll say, in 2016, with the first election of Trump, when 81% of white evangelicals voted for him, this is why we saw this massive exodus, not big enough if you ask me, a massive exodus out of evangelical culture, because it was such a whiplash for so many people. So many of us, well, I had left evangelical many years before that, but so many people were like, wait a minute, you're the Sunday school teacher who raised me to be kind to people, to respect those who are different than me, to be gentle and patient. And now there's an individual on the television screen who brags about everything that Antichrist is, right? Wealth and power, and you can grab women wherever you want to grab them. And you're now saying, yes, that, look, I know we're not voting for a pastor or a priest, we're voting for a president, but still you are saying, yes, that is the person we want to lead us. It just felt like this complete betrayal of everything that evangelicals taught us. It's really sad what's happened.
Do you talk about any of that in The Shift?
Yeah. Yeah, when I outline what I mean by progressive Christian, for instance, like I tried to define my terms, which now, again, I wrote it in 2019. It came out in 2020. The term progressive has it's morphed quite a bit.
Feels loaded.
It feels loaded now. It was less loaded back then. It was more palatable back then. Now it's just supercharged, and so that's the downside of books. It kind of freezes in that time. But when I tried to in the book define what progressive Christian was for me, how I was using the term, I used 4 primary markers. 1 being affirming of LGBTQ people, 2 being aware of racial injustice and working to end in sort of white supremacy wherever you see it. 3, an equality of genders, because evangelicals super into like men being better than women. And then 4, an appreciation for science, that it's a friend of faith and not a foe. And so in each one of those, as I unpack them a little bit, I kind of dip my toe into why those are responses to the evangelical Christianity that many people are now post or ex.
Yeah. Another question that I had about, sort of the idea of the different understandings or focus between a, quote, progressive or even just within mainline Protestantism and evangelical Christians is how we talk about and focus on sin, and how different that is. And I referenced to Colby before we started recording that I had watched an interview that he did at a different church, mostly because I was looking for like question ideas for an event that we're having later today. And you were like, I'm obsessed with sin, with the hamartia. And
that's the title of the podcast. I'm obsessed with sin.
I'm
with
obsessed with sin. And the other pastor was like, yeah, as mainline Protestants, like we don't really like focus on sin or like really talk about it very much at all, other than to say every Sunday you are forgiven of your sins, right? And we move on. All the way down to like we have no such thing of like a hierarchy of sin or what I know gets called an unrepentant sin in evangelical circles. That's not that some sins are unrepentant and some you can repent for, or that somehow God has this order of like which sins are worse than others, or like, do you know what I'm saying? Or like what we now define as a sin, right? Like you only take half the Levitical laws and decide they're sins, but everything else, that's totally fine. Those are just old people. They don't know what they mean because that was, thousands of years ago. But they've still got right that these are still clearly sins. And that's not a thing that we really focus on. And so I was just like, take me in to the evangelical sin world. Because I am a horrible sinner.
I've heard this. About you.
In fact, so much that the end of my my Greek professor always says that you can always remember the word sin because of hamartini. Drinking alcohol is a sin and stuff like that, right? So you have the hamartini. That's clear, and it's got pork in it.
Martini.
Clearly, so instead of hamartia, it's hamartini. So much so that on the day of our Greek final, we actually brought and had ham martinis in
amazing.
Class.
That's amazing.
To celebrate the end of Greek.
Classic.
But that's So bring us into this this sin world.
Yeah. Okay. So, in evangelical world, it is, I think, a reasonable critique. Again, this was me. I knew this world well. I still know it well. It's a reasonable critique to say that for the theological framework of most evangelicals, sin is more powerful than God. Now, they're not going to say it like that.
Yeah, that's a scary.
They're not going to say it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll have some rejoinders as to why that is not an accurate statement. But when you think about what their fundamental baseline of belief is, it is that, all their chips are put into the fall of man. So we are born into a state of fallenness. And so therefore we are born, all humans are born separated from God. That is our birthright, is separation from God. And God, as this holy and just, which is another thing we can circle back to, they will be like, yes, God is love, of course, and just. Like, those sometimes are mutually exclusive. And why do you always pick just to be the one to like be over and against love? But anyway, God as holy cannot stand or be in the presence of sin. And so there has to be some sort of metaphysical disconnect between sinful humans and this divine being who is pure and holy. Okay, so that is the fundamental belief and posture within evangelical for all humans. And
can I break that apart in like 12 seconds?
Yes.
So think about this quote original fall. Also, I hate Augustine. They already know that. It's all his fault that we have this. Think about the original quote fall in Genesis, right? So like they're in the garden. God creates the garden. God creates the serpent. God creates the tree. God creates the apple, the situation. How does that make sense?
Yeah, I know. I'm with you.
For us to say that, like, and also if we're created in God's image and we're created this way, that we have been born immediately separated.
Yeah. It's a twisted God to build a paradise and put one thing in it and say to his children, yeah, but just not that. Like, every parent knows how that's going to go.
Exactly.
Like, so let's not blame us for the state that we're in. Come on, you put us here, in some ways. But
again, so like as a person who is not a biblical literist, right, that I understand this as a piece of literature.
For sure. Yep.
That was written in a certain place and time to explain fundamentals of their understanding of how the world worked in a specific point in time, right?
Yep.
So like,
and to counter other cultures' creation,
right? And that they had to explain, why does this happen, right? And so this is their story to sort of explain their origins, and so they needed to come up with a reason for why humans are bad, right? That we have the capacity for it, that we have the capacity both for good and both for bad, and so we need to put. And I personally think of this idea of like either blaming the devil or blaming, because you're just born inherently, sinful and separated from God. Like, to me, that's kind of like, it's kind of like a scapegoat. Like, it's the easiest way out. If you can just blame sin or blame Satan to not actually own that I have capacity for good and I have capacity to be an asshole. Yeah. And that, like, that's just part of the human, that God created us these complex beings.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's great. I'll add real quick, yes, and by saying that one of my biggest aha moments was the one thing God created everything, called it good, put humans in the garden. And again, I'm with you. I don't take this as a literal fly on the wall account of how things began. But
were you trained in biblical, like,
for sure,
literal?
Yeah.
Okay.
I definitely had my years of Adam and Eve were historical, literal figures.
Okay.
The Earth is about 6,000 to 8,000 years old, for sure.
And science is all they're all bullshit.
Yeah, it's untrustworthy, and if something looks old, it's because God made it that way.
And aliens put the dinosaur bones there.
I don't.
I've heard that one before.
I might have jumped ship within evangelicalism before I really got to their take on dinosaurs.
Oh, okay.
I don't really remember talking about dinosaurs much.
You just like went to the museum and you saw them, but like it didn't click when they were like, oh, these are like 1 billion years old, and you're like, oh, I wonder how that happened.
No, did not click.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just like, I don't think 1 billion, but sure, they probably were around 8,000 years ago. Unbelievable. Well, actually, there's okay. Now you're bringing up memories. I thought I'd repressed these. No, I remember this course in college where one theory as to what the dinosaurs were. This is so fun. Is you remember in the creation story, there's a firmament that covers right, and so this sort of watery dome that covers
that
the
separates
earth.
The waters above from the waters below.
And prior to the flood, that firmament was in the sky. And there was something about how a certain kind of lizard never stops growing throughout his whole life.
Wow.
And so if you remember the literal description of the Bible, prior to Noah, people lived to be like 600, 700, 800 years old. So you can imagine a lizard, because of the firmament in the sky that allows everything to, you can imagine an 8-year-old lizard that's just going to keep growing. It's going to be the size of a dinosaur.
Oh, okay.
And then the flood happens and life expectancy reduces.
You learned that in college.
I learned that in a real classroom in college with an actual professor.
Wow.
Yeah. Special, right? Oh, did you see, by the way, that the world's oldest man, I think, is either going to or has already turned 120.
Wow.
And so there's like this meme going around where there's a verse that says like, and men shall live 120 years and no longer, like after the flood.
I sure hope he makes it to 121.
Like, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
Okay, where are we? How did we get so far?
Sorry.
Sin.
Sin.
Oh yeah, I was going to say one of my favorite aha moments in the creation story was the one thing that God's like, humans, you can do everything. I give you, like, all's gravy, baby. Just the one thing I want you to not do is eat of this fruit of this tree. And I think for many, many years, I was operating on the assumption that the tree was the tree of good and evil.
Oh.
And so eating of the fruit, like, was introduced sin into the world.
Mm-hmm.
But when it was years ago, obviously, when I was like, wait a minute. The tree is the knowledge of good and evil. It's almost as though God is saying, look, humans, I trust you with everything. But the capacity to know the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, essentially the ability to judge, because that's what judging is, right? Is discerning who's good, who's bad, who's right, who's wrong, who's in, who's out. God's like, I trust you with everything, but I think that's one thing that I'm going to keep to myself. And here we are today, like, we are just...
and I wish God would have got to keep that.
I know.
To themselves.
Because that is our silver bullet. I mean, we are so good at that.
Yeah.
We judge. It is in our bones to assess who's right, who's wrong, who's in, who's out. And so I think anytime we can move away from any posture of judgment, I think we're doing ourselves and God a big favor.
Yeah.
By letting God deal. And I'm pretty sure the Bible also later says, God's like, leave the judgment up to me. You know, like it comes up explicitly even later. So, okay, sin. So, as I said, evangelical assumption, everybody's born into sin, we're separated from God, and therefore everybody's destined to hell. Now, you have your Calvinists who would have a predestination theology where before time, God already decided which humans get to go to heaven, which humans get to hell. Mm-hmm. And so none of this really matters because everything's already predetermined.
So what are you supposed to do? Does it matter?
This is why, there's 5 points of Calvinism.
Oh, okay.
TULIP is the acronym, and it's too long since something like total depravity, unlimited something, limited atonement, irresistible grace, which is a way of saying if you're chosen, you're going to eventually
get called.
Yeah. And then P, I think, is predestination. So I only ever maxed out at a 3.5 point Calvinist because I could not wrap, even in the height of my evangelicalism, I could not accept predestination. I'm like, that is hot garbage that God would predetermine billions of humans before the creation of the earth.
Well, they actually wouldn't that essentially make all of life pointless?
I totally agree. They have their workaround for that, which is we're still called to, like, God still needs us to be his hands and feet in the world. So in order to reach the people, it's like, okay, but if grace is irresistible, if it's going to get him anyway, who cares if I do anything? So really, it does not make a lot of sense when you're on the other side of it. When you're in it, especially because you feel good, like, ooh, I'm one of the chosen ones. Like, it sort of, it activates that part. So sin so the reason why I say that for most evangelicals, whether they'll admit it or not, sin is more powerful than God is because what's more powerful, a thing or the thing that separates you from that thing, that the original thing cannot do anything about, cannot overcome, right? So even if God wanted to, in their story, God can't overcome this problem of sin because God is so holy and perfect and pure. And so sin has to be seen as at least as powerful, if not more powerful, because it keeps us from God. And so go ahead. I see your wheels turn and you're really excited about this.
Well, I just isn't that literally what Jesus did?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, and you're correct insofar as that would be the pitch, right? So that is the pitch of, if I'm trying to save you right now, if I'm trying to save your soul, that is the pitch. You were born as a sinner. You are separated from God. You know, there's nothing you can do about it. God's holy. You're a sinner. And you would ask these stupid questions like, have you ever told a lie? And you're like, well, yeah, maybe one time. Like, okay, so then you are destined for hell, right? Like, that's it. You're enough to be a sinner. And
that's one of the big ones.
Any sin is enough to separate you from God because God is perfect and pure and holy. And so then the pitch is, you can't do anything about this state. But the good news is God sent his son to be a perfect sacrifice, so that if you say this prayer and invite him into your heart, then when God looks at you, instead of seeing you, God sees Jesus. And now you draw this chasm, these two cliff edges. You're on one side, God's on the other side with a big chasm between, and then the cross is the thing that allows the little human to
bridge.
Walk across.
Yeah.
Bridge, yeah.
Yeah.
So I walked a lot of people across that bridge in my days. And so in the conservative evangelical world, sin is huge. I mean, it is talked about constantly, both as a thing that you have to account for, that separates you from God, and that you're responsible to like accept Jesus into your heart, otherwise you'll burn forever. And then even after being saved, they have these distinctions about sanctification versus justification. Mm-hmm. Sanctification being, I'll start with justification being, once you accept Jesus into your heart and believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus, you are justified before God. So you're like locked into the Lamb's book of life. Justified, meaning just as if I'd never sinned, right? That's sort of your new state of being. Fun, right? And then sanctification is the ongoing effects of sin. So yes, even though you're justified, sin is still a thing that you're going to have to constantly account for, deal with, manage. So much of Christianity is sin management. And I think they're doing a bad job of it, for what it's worth. Like that's what your game is, and you suck at even your game, sin management. And so sin is just, every sermon in evangelical world will at some point bring sin up. It's just huge. And then as I left that world and we began building a church on the other side of evangelical Christianity with this more progressive Christian orientation, we started to...
Were you like, what am I supposed to preach about?
Kind of. That's kind of where I'm going. It's like, in some ways I was super excited about it, and I would redefine all sorts of other words, redefine like forgiveness and grace and saved, and like, so there were ways that I could like really introduce these terms in fresh ways that helped our people be less triggered by some of them. Because a lot of what happens, and we didn't use this term very much, it was kind of after us, but I don't know if you're familiar with deconstruction, this word that's kind of like tearing apart all your old beliefs and building something new. A lot of people, when they leave evangelical Christianity, part of what repels them is this view of God being angry, just, holy. And so then when you move away from that, you sometimes swing the pendulum so far the other way, where God is pure love and light and goodness. And so then to talk about anything like sin, it sounds too much like the old thing. And so as we were doing our church and I was preaching these messages, I realized, man, I'm not really ever using the word sin because it would like trigger our people too much. It would immediately conjure up this sort of angry, distant, judging, wrathful God. And so for the first couple of years of our church, I don't know if the word sin ever came up. And if it did, if it was like in a song, we would sometimes change the words of songs to make them more palatable. Yeah. And so that was my observation a couple of years ago, was conservatives tend to hyper focus on sin. It's everything. And then more liberal Christians can sometimes take the opposite approach, which is we don't really want to talk about sin. We don't know. We don't have the language for it in a way that either doesn't activate our old conservatives or that doesn't just put us under this oppressive weight of like sin management, behavior management, which doesn't feel like, nobody really gets amped up to think about life in that way. And then I discovered like the history of hamartia, not hamartini, although I will take one later tonight. But that's when I discovered, because it was I finally decided to tackle sin. I think it was the winter of 2019, and I was going to do a series through the book of 1 John, and like 5 verses in, you get to that verse that, if if you claim to be without sin,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I probably should have read 1 John before I committed to this book, because I can't get around that there's a bunch of sin talk right away. So I ended up doing a 2-week, 2-part sermon about sin after this deep dive into this topic. And to this day, it's the most talked about sermon. Like it is the thing that I think people will almost remember the most from our church days.
What? So give me the synopsis.
Okay. So here's the synopsis of sin. So you already mentioned it. The Greek word hamartia comes from the world of archery and literally just means to miss the mark, right? In ancient Greece, prior to the New Testament, this word over time it moved from just a literal missing of an arrow on a target to be a sort of metaphor, saying, euphemism for when people messed up, whatever, right? Missed the mark, metaphorically speaking. What's interesting, though, is when you look at how Aristotle talked about hamartia, and his frame of reference was Oedipus Rex. And if you remember the story of Oedipus Rex, you have, I might forget the characters' names because it's been a hot minute, but essentially, you've got Oedipus who's sent away from his parents at a young age, raised in a different country as under the auspices of some other identity. Later on in life as an adult is making his way back towards his home country, I think. Listen, audience, it's been a minute, but so you can correct AJ later if you want. Oedipus makes his way back to his homeland, runs into the king on the road, gets into an altercation, and the king is his dad, but he doesn't know it, right? Because he's been raised by other family members his whole life. Gets into an altercation with the king, ends up killing the king, continues on the way into the city, and ends up marrying the queen, which is his mom, right? Okay. What Aristotle points out is that both of these mistakes that Oedipus makes, right? Because killing someone's not cool, and incest, probably isn't ideal even in that time. Both of these were examples of hamartia, and what you discover is for the ancient Greek culture, when they talked about hamartia, these were actions committed. Yes, you missed the mark. But the key thing here, AJ, is that you missed the mark because you had a gap in your knowledge, that you didn't know better, that you were ignorant on some key point.
What about the people that do know better and do it anyway?
Well, we can talk about that in a second. But so if the thinking being, if Oedipus would have known that was his dad, he wouldn't have killed him. If Oedipus would have known that was his mom, he wouldn't have married her, right? Yeah. So hamartia, and there was even written into certain code books of laws where if things were termed hamartia, the response was compassion. Like you extend compassion to this person. They didn't know it, which is way different than judgment, a posture of judgment. So I often talk about it like hamartia, you miss the mark. If you're picturing someone shooting an arrow, you miss the mark not because you're a crappy archer. You miss the mark because like no one ever taught you how to pace your breathing or pull the bow back properly or plant your feet. And so you've got these gaps in your knowledge, and that's why you miss the mark. Okay, so it raises a couple questions, such as, well, what is the mark that we're missing and aiming for? And then you say, what about the people who do know and still do it? I'll start with the first. What is the mark? I think the mark that we're aiming for is being rooted and aligned with our true identity. Who I am. Who is the I that is me? And to use Christian language, I talk about that as I'm a child of God. Like that is the truest thing about me. That is the thing that if you are rooted in and you live from, I think this is why Jesus was seen as a hamartia less individual, because I think he was so firmly entrenched and rooted in his identity. He knew who he was. When you know who you are, you're suddenly not extracting from other people. You're not pulling from their life force to try and affirm who you are. I don't mean that in like the queer affirming way. I mean like make me feel better about myself because I don't like who I am, right? This is sort of classic. When we quote unquote sin, we're either doing things that cause harm to other people or harm to ourselves. And I think you can, with almost every scenario, you can look at an act of harm, whether called to self or others, and you can work it backwards to say, okay, there is a gap of knowledge in them. And even the people, like you said, what about people who do know and do it intentionally? I would argue they are not living from who they really are. And if they knew who they really are, and if they were rooted in that place, then they would not do these things. So this is kind of how I work that backwards to say that every act of sin, every act of hamartia, and actually I discovered that Buddhism, this is one of Buddha's teachings, is that all sin is ignorance. I'm like, yeah, okay, now we're on the same page here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Martin Luther said concupiscence, all sin is lust.
What did he mean by that?
The innate human desire to want to be special, to be powerful, to have more, to that, and everything that we do falls into that category, to be better than, to be, which, to be honest with you, doesn't like clash with what you're saying, because part of that is, right, like if I just think about like clothes you wear, right, like if you're confident in yourself, you can wear whatever you want, and like it, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, and I think that that comes down to it, or like the people who hide things that they're doing, right? That like it's because that they're that they're self-conscious to be who they are or to understand, and so like is part of that like a lack of understanding of who we are, right? And so like as you said, if like our true identity is a child of God. And what that all means, right? That like everything that we do that is destructive, both to ourselves, to others, I would also add the creation, right, is a lack of understanding.
Yep. We're missing that mark. That's the mark, and we're missing it. We're missing it. And what did Jesus say on the cross? Father, forgive them.
For they know not what they do.
Yeah.
And today you will be with me in paradise.
Yeah, well, there was that too.
To me, that's one of my, if I were to like break down in theology of like the words of Jesus on the cross, the one where he looks at these two criminals, these two like horrible criminals that are also suffering capital punishment, and says, today you'll be with me in paradise. Yeah. Right? Is there any doubt for the rest of us? Yeah. What could we possibly do to separate us from God? Yeah. And part of that is so we, again, from at least a Lutheran theological perspective, we say God has always come to us, not the other way around, right? We're not earning our way to God. Yeah. Martin Luther uses the language that we are both all the time, 100% simultaneously saint and sinner, that we have this capacity for good and a capacity for destruction, that this is just part of the human makeup, right? That God created us, these intensely complex beings that has all of this capability. And it's just a matter of like, God knows that. Yeah. God made us this way. Yeah. God made you exactly the way you are, and knows even the deepest, darkest, whatever parts of you. God's already there. You're not earning your way to God. Doesn't matter how many times that you say the prayer to cross the bridge. God's already on the other side of the bridge. That's right. Right? And so like for even just real like staunchly stickler Christian things, that we say sort of that the crossing the bridge, if there is one in mainline Protestants, it would be baptism. And even that now is something that like people are starting to talk about.
Interesting. I would love to hear more about that. My initial thought on that is baptism for me feels like a powerful way for someone to take ownership of their identity that's always been true.
I mean, but that doesn't work for baby baptism.
Great. We'll come up with another way to talk about baby baptism. You can bestow it upon it. Like, can it be, it's still because my fundamental operating system, what everything is rooted on, is that we can't be disconnected from God. There's it's literally impossible to not be connected to the divine. It just doesn't make sense. God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, and we cannot be. And
even people who have never heard of God, it doesn't mean that God is still not present with them.
100%. But can we live as though we are not connected to God all the time?
Yeah.
Can we live unconscious all the time? Right? So much of the Colby prior to therapy, which is around age 30, so much of me was living unaware, ignorant, unconscious of the ways that my old childhood trauma had sort of, distorted my view of reality, distorted my view of myself, distorted my view of family and relationships. So a big part of why therapy worked for me in many ways is because I was able to, as Maya says, know better so that I could do better.
Yeah.
Right? This is the connection between understanding and filling those gaps of knowledge so that we can hit the mark more consistently. And this is, I think, even if someone wants to really hold on to, and I'm not saying this is you, but even if someone really wants to hold on to, no, I think there are some people that just they're doing it out of pure intent and knowledge. They're intentionally being evil and wicked. I still submit if that exists, that's so few. Like, it's so few,
Yeah.
and even then, it's probably some deep psychological brain thing that can we really hold them responsible for?
Yeah.
But even if a person wants to maintain, now I can't go there with you in terms of if they knew better, they would do better. I would still say, okay, but I think it's going to serve you better in terms of how you orient yourself to the world, to treat people with compassion instead of judgment, to treat people as you know what, they did that thing and it really hurt and it really bummed me out. It's possible that they were missing some key pieces of information.
Yeah.
There's something about their day that threw them off, or there's something they didn't know about me. If I walk up to you and I give you a big hug and you wince because you have a sunburn on your back and I didn't know, I'm not a terrible person for making you hurt. The pain's real.
Yeah.
The pain's real.
Yeah.
But you're able to be like, okay, bro didn't know that I have a sunburn.
Yeah.
I'm not going to judge him for being a jerk for hurting me. So I think even it changes how we our posture towards others, and that's a lot.
It does. And I'll say this as far as the difference for, again, at least from a Lutheran perspective, though typical of most mainline Protestants, right, that we kind of look at this, is this idea of it is not ours to judge, right? I don't get to decide what's a sin and what's not a sin.
Yeah.
And I don't get to decide whether you're the worst sinner that someone else is, or that you've done some sin that's greater than any of the other ones. I don't get to make that judgment. That's not up for me. My job is to love God and love others.
Yes.
I don't get to make that judgment. I am not the accountant of sins, nor do I think God is keeping an accounting of sins, but only God knows what actually is in that category of missing the mark. And the difference, I think, is, in my understanding at least, evangelical Christians live in a very black and white world. Something is either right or it's absolutely wrong.
It's very rudimentary.
There's not in between. There's never, and what I say, and Pastor Eric says this, the beauty of Lutheran theology is that we are really good at living in the gray area. That life is not black and white. No part of it. All of life is a gray area. And so I can't say what someone does is right or wrong, or yes, we have guidelines from the Bible that kind of especially as the Ten Commandments, these apodictic laws, as would be called in scholarly language, that these are absolute laws, that they are absolutely wrong. But even that, how we interpret them is so different, to the point where that's why I come down, and the fact is that is not my job. My job is to love and to serve. Yep. And so I always describe it this way when people ask me that there's one version of Christianity that has this really long list of what not to do in order to be a good Christian.
Yep.
And what we focus on is what I call the to-do list.
Love it. Yeah.
Love God and love others. And when you focus on the to-do list, none of those things matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's how I always say it. That's how usually I talk about the idea of sin.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church, a few years ago, I remember when they came out with the official proclamation that gambling was a sin, and I was like, okay, it's not good for you. That's for sure. Yeah. It can cause definitely a lot of real harm and destruction in someone's personal life and others with a gambling addiction. But you just made that up.
I wonder if this is what Paul was wrestling with when he said all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. I think he's trying to name that. Do what you want. Love God and do what you want kind of thing. But if your goal is wholeness, flourishing, the abundant life that Jesus talked about. That's kind of the mark, to go back to that analogy. If that's your goal, then yeah, there's going to be things that take you off that. There's going to be things that take you off that. And so it's up to you if you want to do something about that. And it's not always up to you, because you could be causing harm for other people. And then
I'll share with you later, but I want to share a sermon with you that I read that has to do with this wholeness, right? So I did the Reconciling in Christ national liturgy and sermon and stuff a couple years ago that all the churches got to use. And I talked about this idea of wholeness. So I don't remember which I'm blanking about when Jesus says, I think it's the Doubting Thomas, right? My peace I give to you, my peace I leave to you. This peace, the Greek root of that is actually wholeness. And so this idea that what Jesus is leaving us, what Jesus is giving, is this sense of wholeness, that is very much rooted in the Greek.
Yes.
And because it was a gay sermon, I also talked about Moses. I have this theory about Moses is sort of coming out of the closet story, that Moses had to go through this coming out of the closet as a Hebrew, and what that meant in his journey towards finding wholeness and his purpose and his calling that God had for him. Okay, sorry.
It's so good.
That was mine.
It's so good. I don't remember what the word for peace is, but the Greek word for saved is sozo.
Yeah.
And sozo literally means to be put back together again, or to be made whole. So even when you read salvation, when Jesus says your faith has saved you, he's saying your act of trust is working to make you whole again. It's not about life after death, which is what evangelicals focus on.
Yeah.
It is about this is a thing that is
we talk about it too, right? This idea, especially when it's very heavy in the Gospel of John, of this the kingdom, right? That this isn't something far off. This isn't after you die. It is the here and now, that it is about building this kingdom here. And that song's going to be stuck in my head now. And that that is right. So if we're talking about what's the mark, you said it last night with this sort of abundant life kind of thing. If this is what God wants for you, to be whole, authentic, and abundant in who you are, right? That very much changes our idea and our concept of what it means to sin.
Totally.
And also, again, when you then look at it in this perspective, okay, this is my goal, okay? How do I get there? Jesus gives me the directions. Love God, love other people. Because it's also we don't think of it individualistically, right? That it's in all of us. If one person is stumbling, if one person is starving, if one person is not there, none of us have abundant life. Yeah. That is our job to work towards that goal in our common humanity as this children of God, to be the body of Christ. Now I'm just giving a sermon, right? That that's what we're doing. And so anytime someone's getting left behind or shut out, we're not there. And that's what we need to focus on, right? If the fence is keeping someone out, Jesus says, move the damn fence.
That's right.
So when you focus on that, then that's why I say this is maybe why we don't talk about it as much, because we're focused here. And so none of those things matter as much.
Yeah.
Do they exist? Yeah, but it's fine. God's coming to us.
Yeah.
Martin Luther is often misquoted as saying sin boldly. But the idea of where that premise comes from is sort of if you're focusing on these things, this doesn't matter, right? Because if you're loving your neighbors, you're not harming them. If you're working towards your wholeness, you're hopefully not harming yourself, right? And those around you. And so you don't have a hierarchy of sin.
Yeah. I think we solved it.
We did. Because there's also this idea, right? I'm reading currently Out Love.
Yeah, by Julia Rogers.
Yeah. One of my students, I saw her in a documentary. One of my students was like, you have to read this. And so she was talking about this language of why, quote, homosexuality is an unrepentant sin. Because if you're practicing, you are actively committing the sin. So you can't, it's not like you can just, I murdered someone, I asked for forgiveness, I do my time, I'm saved again, it's all fine. But you're still actively ongoing, choosing to. So I guess I just don't understand what gets decided as sort of this category of unrepentant sin versus what's not. Because the problem with that for me is the scripture used to justify this as a, quote, unrepentant sin is the same place that it says, like, don't eat pork or shrimp or mix your clothing fabrics or, a whole bunch of other things. And I'm like, I don't see the evangelicals going around, like, slapping pork out of people's hands. And
No. It'd be a fun ministry, though.
So how do they parse out which one of these Levitical laws that they choose as, like, the worst of the worst?
I think in that, if I were to try to steelman their position on, for instance, the Levitical law stuff, I think they would, first of all, the first move they would make is they would distinguish between ceremonial laws and purity laws.
Okay.
So if anything falls under a ceremonial law, that doesn't apply anymore because the temple's not a system anymore because it's all about Jesus, right? So they kind of get off the hook for a big chunk of them by being like, no, that's under ceremonial. And then under purity laws, they would make a further distinction by things such as, is that repeated somewhere in the New Testament? Do we see that particular prohibition shows up again, in the church or with Jesus? And so with something like this, Leviticus 18:22, a male shall not lie with a male, the lyings of a woman, or I would argue a wife, it is an abomination. They would say that prohibition is repeated multiple times in the New Testament. So that's why that one is sort of for all time, is one way that they would answer that question. But you're not wrong to be to be annoyed by the inconsistency with which they love to take the Bible literally until it's inconvenient. Then it becomes a metaphor or bound to culture. So, I mean, the number of pastors that are out there preaching on sexual sin that don't have one of their eyes gouged out is 100%. And yet Jesus said, if the eye causes you to lust to rip it out, they'll be like, that's clearly metaphor, right? Okay, I agree with you, but what we've established now is you're willing to acknowledge that some parts of the Bible should not just be read literal, and like there's other things going on.
Yeah.
So that's just like a small example of the way in which they sort of betray their own literal approach to it when it fits their pre-existing needs for whatever their system is.
Yeah.
Same with like,
What do they do with like the biblical contradictions? Because the Bible contradicts itself.
They say
all
there isn't.
Over the place.
They say there isn't.
Have they read it?
You ain't lying. So I was interacting with another guy on YouTube today, and because one of my videos just had a side comment about how the Gospels contradict themselves. And he says, if you think the Gospels contradict themselves, that just reveals you haven't actually read them. I've been studying this stuff for 15 years, and anything you think is a contradiction is really just, there's a way to harmonize them. And AJ, I remember being that person. I remember being in college, taking the classes of finding these intricate ways to deal with the contradictions so that you can say they're not a contradiction. And now when you're on the other side of it, you're like, that is absolute asinine. Just let it go, bro. Like, it contradicts. It's fine.
Tell me about this one, because this is really curious.
Okay.
So we acknowledge that there are two creation stories and that there are also two flood stories. That there's, we got the multiple authors, right? So like, I love the flood story as instead of like, in creation we did one story and then we did the next one. In the flood story, they're like
woven
compounded
together.
on top of each other.
Yeah.
So like one paragraph says, they brought 2 of each animal, and the next paragraph says they brought 7 of each animal.
Yeah. How
do we do that, biblical literacy?
Oh, I don't know. I'm so far removed from that now. Like, it has been so many years that it's hard for me to A, remember, or 2, even get in touch with how someone would read that and not be bothered by this seemingly clear contradiction right there. Like, okay. I don't know how an evangelical literalist would handle the flood story, for example.
Maybe I'll have to look that up on my own time, but
that one's beyond me.
That just these are curiosities.
But I know with the Gospels, it would be like, and I'm going to forget the details here, but let's just say one Gospel says there was 2 angels at the tomb and the resurrection. Another Gospel say there was 1 angel, and so they'll say, Well, saying that there was one doesn't mean there wasn't another one. There was just saying that there was an angel there.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Or how about the who
Sure.
Who was at the tomb, or like the order in which the disciples were told, all those things.
Yeah, they get real. I mean, they bend over backwards. The mental gymnastics required. What is it? John, like Jesus dies. Like the relationship to when the Passover meal is.
How
it's
are
like
people buying into
totally.
This is what this is what's hard for me to understand.
It is a. I can empathize with it insofar as at stake for them is their eternal salvation. Okay, so the stakes are big. You don't get bigger than that. Mm-hmm. And for them, their eternal salvation is dependent upon believing the right things. They have to hold on to, depending on which the particular church or denomination is, 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't, whatever the essentials are, they have to believe these things. And if they stop believing these things...
The seven mountain...
What's that?
The seven mountain whatever of... I don't know, this is new to me. The evangelical have like 7 mountains of things that they're supposed to like do in the world.
I'm not familiar with the 7 mountains.
Well, I can't explain it now because it's a very new concept to me.
But the commonality there is that it's all about believing the right ideas, and you have to hold that idea, right? I mean, the silly way to say it is you have to get to the gates of heaven and be able to pass St. Peter's test, of having the right idea. Right beliefs. So when that is the core of what you think is real about reality and God and your relationship with God, then so many other things depend on, you have to protect those beliefs with your life. And so to at all consider changing your mind on maybe a peripheral belief, or to think of the Bible in a different way, because the Bible is seen as this inspired, inerrant, perfect document.
Yeah.
And they feel like it's all or nothing. It goes back to your black and white kind of way of seeing the world. Yeah. It's either all perfectly true everywhere, or none of it can be relied upon for anything.
Okay.
And so they have to hold on to this. Everything's perfect, everything's true, because if they let go of any of that, it starts to threaten the part of them that is they're only okay with God if they believe the right things, and that's really scary. It's
I was
really
scary. Say that instigates a lot of anxiety for me to think that. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That actually just makes me sad.
I agree. That's compassion, right? That's their hamartia, right? They have this serious gap in their knowledge. That the response is, man, that sucks. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It just makes me sad to think that. I mean, that seems just like a fragile faith.
Totally, it is.
And very thinly veiled.
Yep. It cannot withstand questions. It cannot withstand doubts. Yeah. It crumbles pretty quick under certain.
I just had a conversation with a student today. I was like, it's okay to not know.
Totally.
It is also okay to be mad at God.
Yeah.
And you know what? God can take it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that just makes me sad. I feel like there's a depth to a relationship that's missing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Colby, for spending this time. I hope someone else gets something out of this, but this was really great. Just for my own education of trying to understand, because like part of, and this has been since I have moved to the South, of like being surrounded a lot more by this than where I was, kind of insulated in other places that I lived. Of like, there were the evangelical Christians, but like they were just like, over there, but like now they're everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so for me to kind of like try to make some sense of understanding of like where we can come out so differently, and how that changes so much of how we act out into this world of what we believe it means to be a follower of Jesus. Because to me, when I think about being a follower of Jesus and this idea of like, love God, love others, nowhere does that leave room for a lot of this stuff, right? And so I'm like, I don't understand how someone can read the same thing and come out with this totally polar opposite understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Yeah. And so I think that might be honestly one of like the central issues that's happening right now in our understanding and like where the Christian church is, if we can even be considered one body of Christ anymore. It's just, I think that and I see this you see this on the news and it happening in the Senate chambers. They're literally not having the same conversation, right? That there's just some point in time we started talking past each other instead of talking to each other.
For sure.
And when that sort of started to happen, it seems like there's just not just a little divide, but like this huge, incredible chasm, that like it's like we're not even having the same conversation anymore. We're not even worshiping the same God anymore. And so anyways, that was my long way of saying thank you. This was a helpful conversation for me. And I'm hoping that there are others out there to whom that maybe could get a little something out of this too. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much. It's so wonderful to have you in Charleston and just all of the different I say speaking events, but more just like lives.
Yeah.
Watching
did you
just
even
like
tell the audience that I've been here all week and that I'm doing more things? I mean, obviously.
No, I didn't. But I knew it was going to come out a couple weeks from now. But like, no. So Colby's been here in Charleston all week. Has done a couple of stops at congregations, both to preach the gospel and to give his Unclobber presentation, as well as in a room full of college students last night that were like so engaged and asking just like such deep, beautiful questions. And then tonight we have one more. Oh, and you did another like live podcast recording and just like it's just beautiful. This is what we needed, I think, in some of the conversations with some of those the faith leaders that you met this week. Just having these conversations with them of like, what can we do? What are we supposed to do? Like, how do we even like attempt to like be the people that God wants us to be in the midst of everything that's happening around us? And one of the ideas was bring someone else in to talk about it.
Totally.
And so
it's been great to be here. Thanks,
so it was great, and I think that this was a good launching point for all of these communities to work through. But so thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to the last event tonight, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your South Carolina tour, because I know you have a few more stops, so I'm glad that we could make this
Thanks for your hospitality. Thanks for having me again.
I appreciate it. And again, I will just say thank you to the Alliance for Full Acceptance of South Carolina for the wonderful grant to help us to bring you in and to share this message and this good news. So thank you.
You're welcome.
As always, everyone, remember that you can learn more about the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at 10 Football Podcast and wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, the 10 Football Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care.